welcome back from the breakout rooms to our event on new and emerging accountability pressures in the tech space. Our sessions in the morning examined accountability challenges from a legal perspective. What's fascinating to me is that the legal and regulatory track is just one avenue of accountability that's being taken forward in the space. There are other drivers which are aiming to push various actors within the tech ecosystem towards more responsible behavior that don't operate on according to a regulatory framework, including a number of fantastic and groundbreaking initiatives that have originated from global civil society. And this is an area of particular interest to me, not only because I spent the bulk of my career in civil society, but also because I think a lot of the most innovative and sophisticated ideas and standard setting comes out of the civil society space. Partly that's because civil society is able to do things that governments legally or constitutionally can't, or that governments are disincentivized to do. And that allows civil society to sometimes achieve outcomes beyond or distinct from what regulation can. That's not an argument against regulation, but it's an interesting and distinct area of leverage and pressure that I think is worth exploring. So we have another incredible panel to talk about this. Jessica Deer is the director of Ranking Digital Rights. She is founder, former executive director, and board member of SMEX, the Middle East's leading digital rights research and advocacy organization. As a 2018-2019 research fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, she launched the Cirilla Collaborative, and she is also a member of the 2019-2020 class of Technology and Human Rights at the Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, a member of the inaugural advisory network of the Freedom Online Coalition, and co-chair of the policy committee of the Global Network Initiative. Nandini Jami is the co-founder of Check My Ads, a brand safety consultancy working with Fortune 500 companies and leading tech platforms to support accountability for advertising choices. Prior to that, she ran Sleeping Giants, the award-winning social media campaign, which won a Cannes Gold Lion and a Webby Award in 2019. The campaign also sparked a global movement and recently launched the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, along with the Anti-Defamation League, the NAACP, and Color of Change. She's an absolute wizard of online advocacy, and I'm very excited to hear from her as well today. And our moderator is Sedwa Orababor, Access Now's Business and Human Rights Lead. She received her JD from Fordham Law School in New York and an LLM in Business and International Business Law from Universidad Pontificia Comillas in Madrid. Sedwa's work with the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice at Fordham sparked her interest in business and human rights, leading her to pursue the topic as it relates to the technology sector. And she was previously legal and policy fellow working with Access Now's policy team in Latin America. For folks who are interested in putting questions into the chat, I would very much encourage you to do that. I'm very excited for this session. So Sedwa, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to everyone who is making time to join us at the end of what I understand to be a very long, not just day, but week. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be parts of this session towards the end of this event. Michael has already introduced both Jessica and Nandini, and I'm very excited to dive into this conversation with both of you. Jessica, I know you fairly well at this point. We've worked together, but Nandini, just hearing from the brief introduction, some of the work you've done, I'm very excited to dive into that. So actually, we'll just start there. Let's start with, maybe Jessica, we can start with you and then to Nandini, but would be great to hear a bit more about the major projects that you're doing, Jessica, at Ranking Digital Rights.
Great. Thank you so much, Sedwa, and thanks so much, Michael, for putting this panel together and for having me. So at Ranking Digital Rights, we research and report on the effects of corporate actors, particularly tech and telecom companies, the effects of their policies and practices on what I'm thinking more of as the digital public sphere and related areas. Digital public sphere, as we all know, is sort of essential not only for political discourse and government policy making, but also for healthy and efficient markets and other sorts of sort of broad-based sort of fundamentals of our societies. We evaluate and rank what we call the world's most powerful tech and telecom companies according to a set of robust human rights-based indicators that we've developed with input from stakeholders over years in 3 categories: governance, free expression, and privacy. And the other rights that are also implicated are freedom of information, the right to hold opinions, and the right to non-discrimination. And our theory of sort of power and accountability is in this space, in the sort of the digital rights space and the tech space, is that to first have accountability, you've got to have some level of transparency. And so our rankings really measure how transparent companies are in their publicly disclosed policies about their practices. We look at a range of indicators, as I mentioned, in corporate governance categories. And then we look at the companies at the governance level, and then we look at several services, sort of representative services for each company when we're thinking about freedom of expression, which includes content moderation and other sorts of effects or operations, and then also privacy. And we look to see by evaluating these company policies according to our indicators, we look to see sort of what kinds of guardrails companies might have put in place to ensure that their policies are implemented in practice. And I guess, and we look at some normative practices as well. So most of what we do is about what do companies disclose, and those disclosures in their policies sort of establish a baseline for what they say they do. And then some of what we look at is how do they then implement what they say they do through other disclosures. But we don't measure, and really nobody can measure exactly what their practices are and whether or not their companies are actually doing what they say they do. And this is the big problem that a lot of us have, or one of the big problems that we have in sort of being able to understand what company practices are. I think everybody sort of has a good idea now with the Facebook papers of just how opaque company practices can be and just how divergent company policies can be from their actual practices. So for the past 5 or so years, we've published our findings in what we call the RDR Corporate Accountability Index, the last edition of which was released earlier this year in April. And in future, we'll be publishing sort of the index we look at both digital platforms and telecommunications companies. In future, we're going to look at them separately, whereas previously we sort of published our rankings all together. But we want to be able to consider sort of in more depth the distinct roles that each type of company plays in our information ecosystems. And generally, RDR, we play an important role, we think, in sort of establishing this baseline, as I mentioned. And again, just to sort of reinforce, we look at what the policies say, and it's very difficult to sort of figure out what the gap is between what they say they do and what they actually do. And primarily because it prevents sort of evidence-based policymaking, which we desperately need to be able to regulate the platforms effectively, and severely limit sort of the agency of people to access information that they need and want about how these systems or how these companies operate. And as we've also learned from the sort of stark disparity in how Facebook and likely other platforms sort of devote resources to the so-called rest of world versus the United States or Europe, sort of this lack of information or this opacity of sort of company practice and sort of what they do really disadvantages people who are already sort of more marginalized by the digital divide and just simply not being in proximity. I'll leave it there for a moment, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about Check My Ads.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I know that just in my own work, RDR's Corporate Accountability Index has been a very important tool for us in starting to answer those questions of what companies' policies are versus what they're actually doing. So I'll switch before we get into more questions to Nandini now. As I said earlier, would be very interested to hear a bit more about your organization and the work that you do there.
Sure. Hi, I'm Nandini. I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to join you all in this conversation. I can tell we're going to be talking a lot about transparency today. So for me, I come from a slightly different background. I was a marketing manager for a small tech company in 2016 when I saw ads. When I visited Breitbart.com for the first time after the 2016 US elections. And the first thing I noticed as a marketer was that it was plastered in ads from companies that I shop with and that I, that I like. So I immediately knew as a marketer that, ads are not placed by the companies themselves, but by programmatic advertising. So Google and Facebook and other companies are placing those ads there for them. So I co-founded Sleeping Giants, a campaign that for the first time alerted advertisers that their ads were ending up on Breitbart and other disinformation websites. Because it was so easy to take screenshots of ads on Breitbart, anyone could get involved. We were able to grow a community of over 400,000 people who joined us, taking screenshots and just letting advertisers know, hey, did you know your ads are on this website? Like, it's a really racist, misogynist, xenophobic, what have you website. Do you really want your ads funding this type of rhetoric on the internet? And advertisers were very quick to say, no, we don't want anything to do with this, and would block it. And in this way, we were able to grow this movement at scale. We started an Excel spreadsheet, and that grew to over 4,000 advertisers who had publicly confirmed with us and our followers that they were blocking Breitbart from their media buy. The movement also went upstream to ad exchanges. So advertisers were angrily calling their agencies, who were calling the ad exchanges. So over 30 ad exchanges dropped Breitbart. And the outlet ended up losing 90% of its ad revenues within the first 3 months of our campaign. So it was a big success. And at the same time, we did not solve the problem of disinformation. Obviously, we just worked on one outlet, but there's so many more outlets out there. So last year, myself and my current business partner, Claire Atkin, we started a newsletter where we kind of just started to explore, like, why hasn't the ad industry fixed disinformation? Like, why is it that I'm still going to Gateway Pundit and The Blaze and Bongino.com, and we're still seeing ads on all these, other very similar websites to Breitbart? And what we learned in this process was that ad tech companies are, like, first of all, ad tech companies are the ones who are placing these ads, and they haven't really though they have policies against disinformation and hate speech and bigotry and harassment and so on, they're not enforcing them. And not only are they not enforcing them, but we're also seeing that there's all sorts of little nefarious ways that the bad guys are able to still get their hands on advertiser dollars, and advertisers have no idea it's happening. So what we're dealing with is, actually, when we look at the bigger picture, is that advertisers are clueless about their ad spend. So they'll spend millions, possibly billions of dollars. Well, definitely billions of dollars are being spent. We just don't know how much of it is going towards disinformation. Estimates run from $250 million to possibly over $2.6 billion. And still those numbers are just total guesses, because we don't know what's going on in that ad supply chain. It's basically a black box. And once you put the money in, you don't know where it's coming out the other end. So last year, my partner and I, we started an agency called Check My Ads. The agency, which I have to differentiate between now, because we've also launched a watchdog, which I'll tell you about in a second. The agency is, it was our way of going from sort of outside agitators to insiders. So we started to actually work with some of these brands, and what we learned in this past year, having talked to like over 200 advertisers, is indeed that they don't know where their ads are going. They don't know how to check. There's too many channels. There's too many middlemen and too many moving parts in the supply chain. So they're unable to actually control their ads. But more importantly, they're actually not able to even get a hold of their log level data. So they can't even see they can't even get a sense of what URLs their ads are being placed on versus not. This data is kept from them. So we decided that what we need to do is not just work with a handful of Fortune 500 companies and like kind of muddle along. This is a very obviously time sensitive problem. So what we decided to do was kind of go back to our roots as movement builders and start Check My Ads Institute. And that is the first ad tech watchdog, holding the ad tech industry accountable for its ties to disinformation. And what we aim to do is through research campaigns and through sunlight campaigns, bring details, real details about how ad tech companies are tied to disinformation networks and fake news rings and so on, and make that information public, as well as to advocate publicly for advertisers, or advocate publicly for advertisers to be able to put pressure on ad tech companies to drop those outlets. And we also want to educate the public on what's going on and how these ad dollars are being spent, because what we know from Sleeping Giants now is that when the public is aware and they make the connection between ad dollars funding the bad things that are happening in their communities and the world around them, they will speak up, they will put pressure on advertisers, and advertisers will put that pressure on the ad supply chain. So that's what we want to recreate. We want to do it at a much larger level. And our goal is to basically defund the disinformation economy. That's our goal.
Thanks, Nandini. I think that is a very admirable goal, defund the disinformation economy. Now that we have a bit more sense of both of the work that both of you do, I think it'd be interesting if we turn a bit towards the idea of how that work contributes towards accountability. I think you both obviously touched on that, but maybe Jessica, we'll go again back to you. At RDR with the Corporate Accountability Index, which I mentioned before is very useful for Access Now, for other civil society. How do you see that work as a driver for accountability?
Sure. And if I can just say so, I'm really excited to hear about Check My Ads. So that's great. RDR has been looking at ad tech as well over the last year and a half and sort of wondering how do we understand this space, because it is so complicated. So for outsiders. So maybe I'll go into a little bit more detail about the index itself. The index, which you can find at our website, is sort of what we do is we evaluate all of these companies' policies, all the policies that we can find, and we sort of go through and do a content analysis exercise where we see whether or not they address the certain indicators that we ask about. So indicators sort of include like access to policies, do companies do human rights risk assessments, do they report or have a protocol for reporting on data breaches, a whole bunch of different indicators. I think in total it's about 300 different questions grouped in different ways. And we use the answers to those questions, which can be sort of yes, no, or partial, to calculate scores for the companies. And then we rank the companies according to sort of first, second, third, et cetera. We rank right now 14 digital platforms and 12 telecom companies. And historically, over 5 years, I think no company has made above 60%. Don't quote me exactly on that, but there's never been like a really legitimately passing grade. The methodology has changed slightly from year to year, so that could be somewhat mistaken. But I do happen to know that our results from this most recent index, the 2020 index, I think the top scoring company was around 53%. So that's still failing. And we do rankings. We chose sort of the mechanism of a ranking for accountability because it can provide an incentive for companies to actually sort of race to the top, to do better than their peers. So we're not sort of incentivizing the lowest common denominator of practice. We're incentivizing the highest common denominator of practice. So we're hoping to encourage that. And the indicators, I should mention, as I said, like were developed with a lot of human rights expertise and other sorts of expertise for a lot of stakeholders and companies as well. And in our research process, we have a lot of opportunities for companies to engage with us and to give feedback, but the ultimate decision rests with RDR, and RDR doesn't take any corporate funding so that we maintain a very strict sort of level of independence. What we've heard about the rankings is they're very effective at the executive level. They do get discussed, and that there is sort of at least sort of a developing impact. I don't have the numbers immediately, I can find them, but we have seen a significant, it's always very hard to prove causality, of course, because the index is only one effort that is sort of trying to push companies towards the right, towards better practices. But we have seen an uptick in sort of more transparency reporting, more reporting on policies around data breaches, and some other more commitments to sort of human rights over the 5 years. I think the other thing that we're really well positioned to do is that our indicators can be a really good roadmap for companies to actually sort of use as a checklist for what their policies should include. We'd like to see more of that. And we also are able to demonstrate some sort of year-over-year progress or decline, so that we're not just looking at one moment in time, but we're sort of looking at a progression, which is really helpful. So the rankings are sort of one aspect of sort of how we're holding companies accountable, but the data that is produced through the ranking and is also sort of our hope, and where we're sort of looking to go now is to really try and make this data, repackage it, make it more accessible to different stakeholder groups who can use it to really create for their own sort of accountability mechanisms. So a key sort of stakeholder is investors, for example. How do we sort of get our findings and analysis into the hands of investors in ways that can really help inform, particularly environmental, social, and governance investing, and then also that we've used it for policy reports. One that we used we did a report last spring, or 2 springs ago now, COVID, called "It's the Business Model," which we've developed in the last year or so a new set or sort of group of indicators on algorithmic systems and targeted advertising to sort of respond to this really urgent need of figuring out what are companies telling their customers or their users about their algorithmic systems, and how those algorithmic systems are being applied to, among other things, targeted advertising, and use sort of preliminary findings where we found very, very little disclosure on either of those sorts of policy fronts by the companies, to produce a report called "It's the Business Model," trying to focus policymakers' attention not to the content moderation or to the content challenges, which we see as sort of the negative externalities of these systems, but up to the root of the problem. So we're looking for different ways of taking the data, contextualizing it for others, such as Check My Ads or Access Now, or other stakeholder groups, civil society, policymakers, investors, et cetera, so that we can sort of have a more coordinated and evidence-based approach to pressuring the companies.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And Nandini, I'll pose the same question to you as well. I'm also particularly interested to hear about the sort of advocacy that you do that's directed at the ad tech companies themselves. This is an area that's quite new for me. So yeah, if you can talk more about how you see your work as a driver for accountability there, and pressure points that you found effective when it comes to direct advocacy with ad tech companies, would really appreciate that.
I was on mute. So in a nutshell, ad tech companies are, they know that there's a lot of garbage in their inventory, and they do not want to be called out for it. So the scariest thing that could happen to them is someone on Twitter mentioning, adding them, tagging them with, screenshots that provide proof that they've served an ad. Why? It's because they have legal agreements with advertisers saying, this is our supply policy. These are the kinds of inventory quality practices that we have. We do not work with XYZ. We do not, again, we like all that stuff that I said before, the harassment, bullying, the violence, false and misleading narratives, et cetera. We don't work with that stuff. And we have all these layers of technology and brand safety stuff and hand vetted premium published. I mean, it's all garbage. So the reason that we're able to move so quickly is because we just call them out. And we have over time been able to bring in researchers and collaborators who we sort of they'll tell sort of the technical story, or they'll come to us with research. And what we've done that I think is different in the space than what anyone has done before is that we have really worked on making these stories accessible to the public, because there's like the real challenge for researchers who do understand the advertising supply chain all this time has been like, how do I explain this to the average person? And trust me, the first story that we did last year on dark pool sales houses, which has been like sort of a seminal piece of research for us, was it took me like personally 3 months to like 2-3 months to wrap my head around it. The researcher who brought us the story, who had actually done the work, Zach Edwards, we like, trust me, we had like multiple hour-long calls, and I would ask the same dumb questions over and over again. This is really complicated stuff. So we really focused on making this accessible to the public. We focus specifically around disinformation. What others in the industry who have tried to whistleblow in the past have done is to focus on fraud. And you would think that companies care a lot about fraud, right? Because that loses them a lot of money. One of the biggest stories of fraud in the industry is of Uber, who is, I think currently, and I haven't checked recently, but earlier this year, at least, they were involved in they'd initiated a lawsuit or several lawsuits against their agency partners and so on, and all sorts of vendors who had defrauded them out of $100 million. And that was like 2/3 of their entire spend. And the guy who found it, Kevin Frisch, he was their head of acquisition at the time. The way that he found it is so wild. Like, they had just been spending and spending and spending because they're head to head with Lyft, and they need the app. They need the new users. They need to beat Lyft. They need to, hit their growth goals. And the way that he found this fraud was because in 2017, during that Muslim ban time, the delete Uber, that whole delete Uber debacle, that was just sort of the cherry on top for Uber, because Sleeping Giants had been sort of laying it on thick, saying you haven't blocked your ads from Breitbart yet, and they're just dealing with a lot of stuff. And so the CEO of Uber told Kevin, do what you need to do, cut off the Breitbart ads, I don't care. So Kevin went in, instructed the vendors to block Breitbart, and the ads kept slipping through. So what's going on there? Why are those ads still slipping through? And that's when he kind of like went in and was like, okay, who's doing what, and shut down all the vendors that were still allowing Breitbart ads to slip through. And it was only, and by the way, this was a huge deal, right? For a company that is in growth mode, that was him shutting down 10% of his ad spend at that time, which was a big number. And he expected to take a big hit in their performance. And what happened instead was that there was no change in performance. So now he's like, 10% of our spend has been shut down, but like, that's like millions of dollars. What's going on? And that's when he started to kind of dig in. He realized, oh, okay, we've been defrauded of $100 million. But that audit was only started after, as a result of us going in on the disinformation angle, right? And so that's what we've learned over time, that companies, and I don't think like, I've heard him do an interview actually about this whole fraud thing and how he went into work, and he's like, guys, I found $100 million worth of fraud, and everyone just kind of shrugged their shoulders at Uber. They were like, okay, have fun with that. They don't care, it's not their money. So, and it's not just an Uber thing. This is a thing across the board. Companies, for some reason, don't seem to care when they're defrauded. And this goes, from what we understand, this goes all the way to the top, because nobody really wants to find fraud because it would just get a lot of people in trouble. It would get the CMO in trouble, it would get the agency in trouble. Everyone's just kind of covering for each other. So fraud was never going to work. That was never going to be an angle for us. But disinformation and brand safety, and I can do a quick thing on brand safety, which is basically that brands don't want their ads to be on any of the like dirty dozen, like violence, terrorism, adult content, gambling, etc. And that's the thing that they care about. So like 75% of all marketers in the world prioritize brand safety. That's the thing that keeps them up at night. So if someone tweets out at a company, at an advertiser like I do, that goes straight to the top. That goes to the CMO, that goes to the CEO, and people get in trouble very, very quickly. That is evidence, you know, that's not fraud, that's evidence. And that's the kind of thing that hits your brand equity immediately. These companies are terrified of social media crises. They don't know how to handle it. They're very conservative and they want to stay out of trouble. So they are not going to stick around when, you know, for the fallout. So that in a nutshell is why we're able to move so quickly. Really, the picture is a very powerful thing. And more recently, I've been using a tool called Analytics. It's a browser extension, and I encourage you all to sign up for it. It's free. One of my collaborators, Dr. Christoph Franizak, runs it. He's just an incredible researcher and has helped us find some really, really interesting findings and insights. And I use this now to tell me what ad platforms are serving whose ads on a page that I'm looking at. So it's super helpful. I've been using it right now to this week I've been demonetizing two websites, Bongino and Bongino.com and the postmillennial.com. And what I've done is just go straight to the ad exchange, the ad network, provide them with that screenshot, and it's pretty much over at that point. So it's, you know, they know they're not supposed to be there, and we're just holding them to that. It's just incredible that no one has been there, you know, been here before, doing it before we were. So.
Yeah, thank you, Nandini. I've been fiercely taking notes. to pick up on, but one thing that really stands out to me, and I'm sure Jessica, you might feel the same, is like working in the sphere that we do, some of the tactics we use are quite different. Like, for example, Amazon is not going to give a crap if anyone tweets at them for anything. So it's interesting thinking of, even within this wider idea of what the tech sector is, which includes social media platforms, but also ad tech companies, that there are still different ways of putting pressure on companies. So I thought we could switch the conversation a bit more to talk about something that both of you have picked up on, which is on this idea of what public accountability looks like, right? So it strikes me that when Nandini, when Michael was reading your profile earlier and talking about Stop Hate for Profit, that is very much, you know, a movement that seems that a lot of the success was because of the larger context of what we were living in through last year. So if both of you could weigh in a bit on what public accountability means to you in your work, and how you've seen wider social movements affect and drive the change for corporate accountability. We'll go from there. Oh, naturally, I would just quickly remind our audience that in about half an hour or so, we'll open it up to audience questions. So feel free to put any questions in the chats, but maybe Jessica, I'll start with you, and then Nandini will go back to you.
Thanks, Cassandra. For me, this is such a reflective question. What does public accountability mean? I think it means different things at different levels, depending on sort of what your view is. If I think of myself simply as a user of a service of one of these companies, then public accountability means that sort of I can readily assess, you know, whether or not like I'm going to have a primarily positive or negative experience with this tool or this company. And if I'm in a civil society role, I suppose, then I think that there probably there's more rigor or more sort of specific criteria that I would think of for public accountability. I tend to think of the public interest. I'm a former journalist, and I sort of think about working in the public interest. So the way that I think about sort of what we do at RDR is really sort of, what, as an entity that has so much power and so much money in today's world, where we're seeing increasing sort of income disparity, where there are still lots of issues around racial justice and social justice, where, just looking at a society and looking at the fact that we have, there's so much promise and potential. Sort of what are these organizations or companies, and in government I include in this as well, and how are they sort of moving us towards more equity, better rule of law, et cetera. So I think of it in terms of the public interest. I think of it in terms of being able to access information, being able to be informed and make decisions, but not having the burden of having to, that being informed doesn't mean that I have to have the burden of reading every privacy policy word for word, and that's an impossibility, right? So there's got to be some individual responsibility, some societal responsibility, and then some certainly corporate and government responsibility, that we're all sort of working together to create an environment of trust, of mutual trust, let's say. So for me, that's kind of what corporate accountability or public accountability means. I missed the last part of your question, which is sort of what initiatives maybe that I've seen, or what was the second part?
Yeah, the second part was more about how larger social movements have contributed towards public accountability.
Well, I guess I sort of, think about freedom of information requests. I think about investigative journalism. And I think about, I sort of think about it in the sense of, again, like it requires many actors working at once on different paths to sort of coalesce into something that looks more like public accountability and public interest. And I think, as a relatively new sort of field or endeavor, as we think of digital rights and as the internet sort of positions us, even though it is, much older now than it was, but it's still relatively new and sort of the sweep of human history or whatever, that, it takes time to get to a place where you can have sort of a common understanding of what the threats are, and how they integrate with how we live our lives, and then what to do about it. And I think we're finally sort of getting to a point where we are sort of maturing in understanding what the threats of these technology and telecom companies are, both from the technical perspective and also from the just amassing of wealth and power perspective, and that we're now starting as civil society, we're starting to become a movement in and of ourselves who would be able to create more public accountability. I hope.
Thank you. That's that's very elucidating. And Nandini, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm a marketer, and as I said, and when before I got into all this stuff and I was just trying to sell product management software, I viewed one of my personal KPIs was, are my customers repeating my language back to me? So at the time, I was selling product road mapping software, and I wrote a blog post one day. I published a blog post that said, how to build a roadmap everyone understands. And I've since left the company, but actually, if you Google product roadmap, there's some popular product roadmap search, but at some point I realized that other people are Googling how to build a product roadmap people understand. And that's a direct result of my post, which made it all the way to the top. What am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that that you have hit some level of success, or that you have hit a nerve when people are using your language back at you, and they're now searching it and they're building on top of it. And that's a lesson that I took with me into Sleeping Giants. When I was running this campaign, I was my goal was always to explain things to people in a way that they could understand, and then use that language to sort of recruit other people into what we were doing. So we were very, I was always like in the community responding to the comments and sort of just kind of guiding people along with the arguments that they need to use. Like, for example, the whole like, you're shutting down free speech thing. Like, well, actually, we're not. We believe everyone has the right to say what they want, but they don't have a right to advertising dollars. And those are the kinds of like lines that we kept putting out over and over again. And eventually that sort of like became a thing. Like, I don't have to say it all the time. My followers are saying it for me. We're really building a movement out of this shared set of values that we can all articulate together. And so that's the kind of thing that that I'm trying to focus on doing again. With regard to the Facebook Stop Pay for Profit boycott, I think it was a nice idea. It was not mine. Someone had to do something to yell at Facebook after all the bad things that they did in a very stressful and horrible summer last year. But I fundamentally don't believe and never believe that it would really change anything, because like you can't really, like the most you can do at Facebook is throw rocks at it. We're all locked into it. But the way that I look at things is not in terms of like, oh boy, I guess we're helpless, but in terms of like, well, okay, what leverage do we have and where can we create some kind of public accountability? And what we have found is that, yeah, Facebook and Google own so much of the advertising landscape, but there's this whole other like universe of ad tech companies that also, by the way, like send that $2 billion or whatever to the disinformation economy. And we can start there. We can start some kind of a movement there. And so I think that like the energy and anger and frustration that we're all feeling, what I'm really trying to focus on doing as far as public accountability is really, I mean, my goal is to help people understand you're not going to be able to do anything with Facebook right now, but join us and we will we'll get the ball rolling in a really big way. Because like, for example, all those disinfo sites that Facebook pulls to the top of the Facebook top 10, we can demonetize that. Like we can demonetize it on the other end, not on facebook.com, not on the platform itself, but on the open web. And that's a place to start. And that gets that muscle kind of moving for marketers. Marketers are like, oh yeah, we can block that website. Oh yeah, we can, ensure that our ad spend isn't going towards those middlemen. And what that allows us to do is also to build on top of these wins. So like another thing that another sort of tactic or strategy that I use is, we start with one, we focus on one tech company. And then once we've gotten that one, we kind of build on it. Okay, like X company has dropped this outlet. What about you? And then what about, these two companies have dropped the outlet. What about you? And that way we're really able to build momentum. We're able to build traction. People are able to see that movement. And that's so important that people are able to see the progress and that their voice is making a difference and their retweets and their emails are making a difference. And so that feeling of movement is so, so important. And that's what we focus on so that they can see that change happening in front of them.
And I think that's such a great framing of the issue, right? That when we look at a sector like the tech sector with companies like Facebook and Amazon, that it feels like giant is not a big enough word to describe what they are, that oftentimes the problem can feel overwhelming, right? That things that there won't be change. But this idea of really reframing around other players, other stakeholders that are more susceptible to pressure and using that as a way to sort of work upward, I think it's very encouraging. And actually, this is maybe slightly off topic, but Jessica, I know that you were saying earlier and through the work that I've seen from RDR that you're doing more work with investors. So I was wondering if you could, share a bit more about how you see investors as a similar kind of stakeholder group that can put pressure where we as civil society cannot.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I was sort of thinking Nandini's sort of, follow the money, basically, we can demonetize. And I think that's a conclusion that, so my predecessor and the founder of Ranking Digital Rights has had for a long time, Rebecca McKinnon, just sort of, she did a lot of investor focused work with RDR, and we're trying to continue that now. And I think the moment is kind of now, because we're seeing a lot of development in the environmental, social, and governance investor space. And for example, just recently, RDR has been working with a group called the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. What's happening there is that they have taken the 26 companies that we rank every year, and these companies are 7 of them are based in the United States, and the rest of them are based in other places around the world. So we're truly a global scope of what we do, and there are investors who are talking to those companies about the findings from our index. And just a couple of weeks ago, there was a press release about investors with $6 trillion worth of assets. And I'm just trying to find the actual language right now, are pressing the tech sector to commit to RDR's human rights standards. And so I don't know, is there an option to put links in the chat here, or is the chat accessible? I'm not sure. If there is, let me know, and I'll do it later. But so we basically are doing, investor outreach. We're trying to translate our findings into digital rights risks. Like, how can investors think about our findings as potential non-financial risks for their companies? Thanks, Lex. And I'll put it in the chat in a second. And sort of, how do you translate the risks of these platforms into something that an investor who's really focused on bottom line and shareholder price and make a difference? And so there's groups of investors who are really looking at environmental, social, and governance issues with different companies. And I guess I think again, this goes back to sort of what is the definition of public accountability and public interest. I think historically we think of companies as being the bottom line is the only thing that matters. I think increasingly, that there are more companies that understand the reputational risks of behaving in a certain way, and perhaps who also just see that by worrying about social issues is actually sort of it can be a benefit to your bottom line as well. And so we're looking to make that case. We're looking to help investors understand what the digital rights risks are and do a better job at storytelling in the way that Nandini is obviously very skilled at, and sort of making that translation of like, this is why you should care, and this is how it relates to what you're trying to do and where you want to put your money. And I hope to see that the 6 trillion goes to 60 trillion in the next time. And the other thing that's a part of that is shareholder advocacy. So, when we're talking about investors, we're talking mostly about institutional investors, but another mechanism that we're increasingly trying to work more systematically on is shareholder advocacy, and working with groups that put together shareholder resolutions to include resolutions in their shareholder meetings and to vote on those resolutions, which again turns out another set of policy challenges in terms of SEC rules on dual class shares and things like that, which I can get into if we want to a little bit later. So we're trying to translate and sort of really repackage what we do for specific audiences, including investors and shareholders, hoping again, that we need to focus on the money and sort of what supports these companies. And I think what I'd love to see as well is more watchdogging of the lobbying that these companies do, because they spend wildly on lobbying, and it is really having an effect in terms of the policy conversation.
No, it absolutely is. I mean, we've been in many conversations, multi-stakeholder conversations with companies who might actually take a more favorable stance in our conversation, and then they turn around and spend a bunch of money in DC lobbying for exactly the opposite thing. So this idea of really, of looking at corporate spending, where it's going to, what they're supporting says honestly to us much more than other words that they might put out publicly, for sure. So actually I was thinking that we could change the conversation, the focus a little bit, to talk more about the wider global impacts of the tech sector. So many of the companies we've mentioned today are the big US tech giants, but even the companies that are US companies have impacts that are far reaching. And, you know, picking on Facebook because they're great, easy targets to pick on, the recent whistleblower and Facebook paper revelations have shown us a lot of things that they're doing wrong here in the US, but really frightening things happening outside of the US. And oftentimes, you know, it's easier for us as people sitting here in the US to be more concerned about what's happening here. But I'd be interested to hear from both of you again, how the work that you do and the campaigns you do take into account the impacts that the tech sector has outside of the US and how you communicate that to the audiences that you advocate with. Nandini, do you mind going first?
Sure. So I will have a limited answer to this because I've never really tried to step outside of my lane, which is mostly the US and I guess a little bit of Canada. But what is inspiring is that Sleeping Giants as a model was able to, I guess, inspire other folks who are just like you and me to start their own Sleeping Giants. So there's a whole bunch of other Sleeping Giants chapters. There's one in Canada that has worked on demonetizing the rebel. There's one in France that is super active and like awesome and has just done a lot of stuff there. And also, by the way, using their regulatory frameworks there to try and get a Sleeping Giants amendment passed and a couple of other things. But the sort of big runaway success story is Sleeping Giants Brazil, which has I mean, that thing grew in like days to be so much bigger than our original campaign. Like they were really, really looking for something that they could latch onto and really to grow some kind of a counter movement. Sleeping Giants Brazil made it to the sort of national headlines within 6 days, I think. It was just like it just grew to this, it just started to dominate the national conversation. It's just so clear that there's something there, you know, like that we're such an ADD generation, and to just see like this change happening in front of our eyes, that's something that can scale. Regarding the other issue that I want to talk about for as far as global impact is one of the things that we've been really, really critical about in our work and research is brand safety technology. There's 3 main companies that offer this service: Integral Ad Science, DoubleVerify, and Oracle, and then to a lesser extent, ComScore and a few others. These companies are basically in charge of deciding. They have partnerships with Facebook, with YouTube, with everybody in the entire world, and they basically decide how money is distributed across the entire internet. And their technology is so shoddy in English, like it barely works in English. What they basically do is they have 2 things. One is called keyword blocking. That's sort of their so-called more like analog-ish sort of like solution to brand safety, which is, you know, just block all the bad words, and we'll make sure that anything that has those bad words we won't serve your ads on that. But the problem with that is that at first, you know, it was words like bomb and terrorist and shooting and stuff, which was never good to begin with, because like people need to cover the news, and those are words that describe things that happen in the news. But what happened over the years, particularly after the Sleeping Giants campaign, just scared advertisers. They started to add all kinds of words into those lists. So they started adding, like, after the Parkland shooting, they just put Parkland and Florida, and like, so now we're just blocking everything, and it just doesn't make any sense. Like, on no level does it make any sense, because also the brands are not appearing on the news, and that's where people are at reading the news. The other thing that they use is keyword, and this is really, really dangerous. This is semantic intelligence, contextual analysis. They have a bunch of different words for it, but these are basically, and the way that they sell it into companies and as sort of like a value-added service is that we have a proprietary algorithm that scans a piece of content that tells you, that understands what a piece is about, like what the subject/topic is, and whether it is positive, neutral, or negative sentiment. And this is just a bonkers, idea to begin with, because like, who is deciding what is positive or negative sentiment? And what we were able to find last year, because Integral Ad Science, for a very brief period of time, I'm talking like 12 hours, released a demo of their contextual analysis tool. Like, I went in and I put in all the URLs to see what's positive, what's negative, and all the white nationalist stuff was positive or neutral, and anything covering Black Lives Matter was negative, like legitimate news articles. And so this is happening and they pulled it for a reason, right? Because we started to point that out. So this is an extremely dangerous technology that we have no insight into. Nobody else will share their algorithms. They won't share it with advertisers. So we have clients who have asked for log level data just to understand, like, hey, which things are you blocking? Which things are you not blocking? And they won't give it to them. So this is a very, very serious issue. And if it doesn't work in English, what hope do we have for the rest of the world? So this is a urgent, imminent issue because it is actively, one estimate of keyword blocking technology is that it has blocked $2.6 billion from the global media industry. So this is tens of thousands of newsrooms that are being defunded as a result of this technology around the world.
Yeah, thanks, Nandini. That's really, surprising and not surprising to hear, at the same time. That seems to be also the reaction to things like this. Just picking up on the points about if there aren't enough resources being put into understanding how this works in English, what does that mean for other languages? That's another thing, right, that the Facebook papers and the whistleblower revelations revealed is how much resources are being poured into one area of the world versus another. And of course, we see the harms that come from that, where things that that are already bad enough here in the US become exacerbated, especially when paired with governments with weak rule of law. But yeah, Jessica, I'll turn the question back over to you as well about ways that you take into account the global impacts of the tech sector in the work that you do.
Thanks. I want to just that is so fascinating about the keyword blocking and the semantics. I'm also not surprised, but I can't help sort of making the connection between those tactics and the tactics of authoritarians around the world. The way, in authoritarian regimes, the way that you conduct censorship is through keyword filtering and blocking, and also, certainly trying to deploy these kinds of tech to sort of, decide what people are talking about, whether it's positive or negative. So it's no wonder we're getting the results that we are, both in terms of sort of user-generated content and in terms of ad content, and the inability of companies to either enforce their own terms of service and their decisions not to sort of report transparently on how they do that. So in terms of sort of the global impact, so our methodology and our indicators are all open for anyone to use, and we are increasingly, so over the years, we have worked sort of on an ad hoc basis with organizations around the world, in Russia, Kenya and Senegal, and the Arab region, India and Pakistan, and worked with organizations who wanted to take our methodology and sort of adapt it for their own sort of more localized research, to sort of look at a set of apps in their own country or region, or to compare, which is often very interesting, what the policies look like at a headquarters level, or at the headquarters level, versus what policies look like in specific countries or regions, and see the discrepancies there. See the discrepancies even in the policies of how companies treat people in their home markets versus how they treat people in other markets, or how they sort of protect rights in different places. So we're starting to systematize that work more, working with more organizations. Part of my background is I founded and led an organization based in Beirut, Lebanon for 12 years, working in the digital rights policy space and in the Arab region. And so we were one of the organizations that did this adaptation before I came to direct RDR. And so we're working to sort of systematize how we can do that, how we can support other organizations and other researchers to take our methodology and do more sort of, more incisive research on corporate accountability issues in their regions. Certainly the US, the big companies have a huge impact around the world, and we also try to incorporate that. One of the things in our own sort of analysis and findings, we do jurisdictional analysis with the index in the different jurisdictions where the companies operate. And one of the things that we persistently or sort of consistently call out is that even in more repressive regimes, you can still uphold a certain level of people's rights as a company, unless, in some places, maybe you're forbidden to disclose certain things, but not all the time. And so that's not it's not an excuse, basically. So we definitely take a global perspective. We participate in policy fora at many different levels, at the US and also internationally in certain groups, but in certain sort of policy groups, but we work directly with researchers, both for our own index. A lot of the research that is done by researchers around the world who have very specific language knowledge and contextual knowledge, and we're now systematizing that. And I encourage anybody who's interested in doing an adaptation of our methodology, whether it's in the US or anywhere else, to let us know, because we are building infrastructure for that right now.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica. I have one final kind of area I'd like to focus on before we open it up to any questions from the audience. But I wanted to let both of you know as well that before we do open it up to audience questions, I want to give each of you the chance to ask each other questions. It seemed like there were things that came up through both of what both of you said that the other person picked up on. So before I open it up for audience questions later, I'll give you the chance to ask each other any burning questions you may have. But I guess the final area I wanted us to take our focus to would be about government or regulatory legislative pressure. So the work that both of you do is an important tool for accountability. But I'm interested to hear from you, do you see the work you do as a complement to replacements in areas where there's a failure of government action? So where do you see your work in relation to government action, or in some places, the lack of government action? And Nandini, we can start with you.
Sure. Government action is my most weakest area of expertise, so bear with me. What I believe is that the issues that I work on are very touchy, and it is absolutely the case that we don't want the government coming in, or at least in my view, that we don't want the government coming in and deciding what is disinformation and what's not disinformation, and making those decisions. I strongly believe, at least in the United States, I don't want to speak for the world, but in the United States, the way that it works is that we are at a place where we have the cultural sort of power to enable the sort of progressive society that I am fighting for, like a progressive, inclusive society. And so that is the power that we are able to harness to make the change that we're looking for. As far as government regulation, I would love to see the government give advertisers back access to the data that they've never really had. I think I would feel comfortable with the government getting involved there. so just so that advertisers have the tools to be able to even just to do the basic things that they need to do to protect their brand. So I don't know. I don't know if this is answering the question, but I support anything around more transparency, government involvement around transparency, and not anything beyond that.
No, that certainly does. I think there's no one easy answer. Again, looking at what jurisdiction we're talking about, the topic, the area. Yeah, there's certainly not an easy answer, which is why I'm having both of you answer the question. So Jessica, how about you?
I think Nandan is right. Like transparency and mandates for transparency, particularly in the ad market, I think is something that RDR is very interested in. Other sorts of mandated transparency, I think, where it is permissible by law. We are looking at things. There's been, we also want to, I think, mandated sort of researcher access, you know, even with some parameters or guardrails around that. Like, part of the problem, as I said in the beginning, is that we don't have enough information about how these companies operate. And it sounds like not only the platforms that we look at, but also the ad companies that Nandini is looking at. We don't know how they operate. Everything is proprietary and opaque. But I think that these companies, because they are shaping and forming and influencing the digital public sphere, which is essential for everything else that we do in life, that there should be some, like, the claim of being proprietary should not apply sort of, you know, wholesale. It needs to be something that's negotiated with civil society and with government and all stakeholders. We're in a different age now where the public sphere is sort of evolving into something different and has different forms of control. And so we need to think about what are governance mechanisms, new governance mechanisms. And I think that might be in the next session, but how do we start to sort of rethink how we increase our agency in this process for more public accountability? So we're looking very closely at legislation that's coming out of Congress right now, and things like perhaps the Social Media Data Act that Lori Trahan from Massachusetts has introduced, and which talks about ads and ad libraries, and also researcher access as being ways that we can start to get more from the companies without sacrificing freedom of expression or First Amendment rights, which we really think is sort of a non-starter for a variety of reasons. And other sorts of policy changes, as I mentioned earlier, have to do with some like corporate governance rules and SEC rules. One of the big problems that I think not a lot of people understand, and this pertains directly to shareholder advocacy, is that a lot of big tech companies enable or have what are called dual class shares, which inflate, or actually at a multiple of 10 or 20 sometimes, the number of votes that people like Mark Zuckerberg have. So there's absolutely no way that shareholders can actually sort of pass a resolution that will have a real effect on company governance, because the people in power have designed it so that they will always stay in power. Yet another reference to sort of the authoritarianism that we see in this space. So those are a couple of the things that I think about from a policy perspective, and that we're sort of working on. I think a really low bar, which unfortunately probably isn't low enough, is that we really need some federal data privacy legislation. There is no US federal data privacy legislation. And I think that if we were able to have a strong federal privacy legislation that is, protects rights and can think, be smart about how it governs data privacy and protection, that could go a long way to reining in some of the really bad practices that we see.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I think I would just add on the point of looking beyond the US and what we can expect or can't expect from governments there. A big part of the work that we do at Access Now is just understanding where and in what jurisdictions we can't really count on government's action. So on issues like internet shutdowns, for example, where governments are the ones that are the main bad actors there, we try to look to other tools, and essentially the conversation we've had today of other stakeholders who are involved, of ways of getting the public to understand and to care about the issue as leverage points. But ultimately, governments have a duty to promote and to respect the rights of those under their power. So, we'll certainly like to see more governments take up the mantle to make good regulation and good legislation, and not just necessarily the ones that are funded by the companies with the deepest pockets. Before I turn it over to any questions from the audience, and I see we have a couple in the chat. Nandini and Jessica, I wanted to give both of you the chance if you have questions for each other. I'm not sure if you've had the chance to have a conversation before, but it strikes me that there's a lot that came out in both of what you said that seemed very interesting to the other person.
I can start. Jessica, I was curious. Shareholder action is a very interesting space to me, and one that I don't understand very well. It's just I'm not that well versed in it. Earlier this year, or was it last year? I can't remember anymore. But Omnicom and Home Depot shareholders filed a resolution asking for an advertising audit of clients. Well, for Omnicom, it's a holding company, so for all the clients of Omnicom and Home Depot, and it was shut down. And that was the first time that our work was on such a high, that was the highest level I've ever seen our little lowly ad audit, ad review, little corner of the world, was in the New York Times, so I was just curious, what are some ways to successfully bring an issue like that into the mainstream or into the sort of the shareholder world that might be able to get that might be able to get the public involved in some way? Is there some way to harness public pressure into actual shareholder action? Or is that a difficult question?
Well, it is. So I'll just be really honest with you, in that we are actually trying to figure this out ourselves right now. And I believe Access might also be sort of starting to explore some of this space. I'm going to share what we have. So I think it's a fantastic question. I'm going to share something that we've been putting together for the last couple of years, which is sort of what we call the notable digital rights related shareholder resolutions. And what we've been looking for are resolutions that adhere to our standards, or somehow you can see it all the way on the right hand side. It says relevant RDR indicators. It's not a very user-friendly way of looking at our indicators, but G is governance, F is free expression, and P is privacy, and then it's different aspects of it. So we've been trying to track shareholder resolutions that either cite our index or cite specific issues that we generally cover, and see what happens to them. And we're getting ready to update this. We have been working and will be working with an organization called Open Mic, which does a lot of investor and shareholder advocacy. You may or may not know them. And there are a few others, I think, that are looking at this. But then there are some campaigns that Share Digital Action, and some of us are some campaigning organizations that do some shareholder advocacy, maybe among other things. But to be really frank, it's new that shareholder resolutions are including these sorts of things. And so it's new for us to figure out exactly how do we go through the process of helping. And we're actively engaged in that right now with the Investor Alliance and Human Rights. And probably what you and I should do, as Sajja sort of alluded to, is have a conversation offline or online, but off the panel, and talk it through and see what we can download to each other.
Yeah, totally. Omnicom, the Omnicom Home Depot thing that I mentioned was actually led by Open Mic. So
great.
Yeah.
There you go. So I think it would be a great thing to sort of look at, and maybe we work on the resolution table if you know of other ad audits and things like that. So we're going to be working with them in the next few weeks, and would love to include you in that.
Yeah, I love it.
And I'll just quickly add that from our part of Access Now, so we haven't done, as Jessica said, we're getting a bit more into the space, not trying to hire someone to do this. But another thing that we've seen in addition to shareholder resolutions are, as Jessica mentioned earlier, just even letters, right? A coalition of shareholders together to put out a letter is such a big deal. I think a good example for us is earlier this year, we had a campaign to ban biometric surveillance. So calling for the ban of facial recognition and other forms of biometric surveillance that enable mass surveillance. And it was a very large civil society focused initiative. But at the same time, shareholders were thinking of a similar thing and put out a statement with, I forget how many billions or trillions of dollars represented, putting out a statement also calling for greater attention to the discrimination and disparities that exist in facial recognition. So I think those two things working together is the perfect sweet spot of getting shareholders to understand an issue that civil society has been pushing, and also helping civil society understand the impact that investors and shareholders can have, and the access that they have to areas that we are, sometimes shut out of. So, yeah, we're trying to figure out as many ways as we can of tapping into that power. And I will take any notes from what Jessica said as well. So Jessica, I wanted to make sure that to see if you had any questions that you have for Nandini before we take the questions in the chat.
I have 100 probably. I guess I'll kind of punt this and just say, Nandini, I'd love to invite you to do a brown bag on Check My Ads for our team, because I think it would be really, really useful for us. Yeah.
I would love to.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. I'll be in touch.
This is, I love this so much. So there are a couple of questions in the chat. So there was one from Michael that I think we already touched on around transparency mandates. So maybe we'll go to the question by Joe, which honestly is probably, I'm sure, what many people are wondering. Just as a member of the public, is there anything that we can do to help or get involved in any of these issues we've been talking about today? So I'll let either of you take this first.
Okay. Please sign up for our newsletter. checkmyads.org/branded is where our investigations and basically our newsletter comes out every 2-3 weeks, and we work so hard to make it accessible to you to understand. And the more members that we have, the more newsletter subscribers that we have, the more people talk about it. And that's what we want. We want people to be talking about it. We want people to understand the issues. And then to retweet and LinkedIn share and all that kind of stuff. That's so powerful. Again, the reason it's powerful is because the ad tech companies are terrified of being in the spotlight. And so the more that we say their names out loud and we're like, hey, what are you up to? What are you doing? That freaks them out. So that's one way to help. Another way to help is to become a checkmate. We do need help, financial support to make our watchdog work, especially in our first year in operation. So checkmyads.org/membership, become a checkmate. And that's not just about the money. It is really about what we want to do is really sort of build out an army of people who not just read the newsletter, but we would actually like to build out sort of a way to educate our sort of super fans on how the ad tech supply chain works, and even just kind of hand off some tools to our checkmates to do their own research that we can highlight, that we can use to do further advocacy. So much of the work that I do is not that hard to do. And this way we can work together to sort of like what I want to do, what my vision is for the organization is for another sleeping giants like movement, but this time with more sophistication and with a much more sort of strategic, laser focused goal. Again, like we're not just trying to go after one outlet here. We're really trying to address the entire economy. And I think those are the two ways to get involved. Yeah.
That's great. From RDR's perspective, we do a lot less sort of outreach to the general public, although we should create more pathways. But I would say the most important thing for us would be to take a look. I mean, take a look at our report, subscribe to our newsletter, but also if you have the opportunity to write to your representatives or your congresspeople about some of the tech issues that are going on, and to mention our empirical evidence. A lot of what we do is the data that we produce is unique to us, and it helps a lot with policymaking. And the same if there are organizations or civil society organizations, local orgs or others that you think would benefit from sort of doing a very directed through research on sort of what policies and practices are, to reach out to us or to them and sort of encourage them to look at the methodology that we have and the standards that we have in particular. And I guess just generally as a self-educating, I guess, sort of enterprise, like if you look at our standards, it will help you know what you should be expecting from these companies. I think a lot of times we don't know what we can expect. We don't know what our rights are. These companies just appeared and they started giving us services, and we all know that if you're not paying for it, you're the product by now. But you really do have a voice if you understand what is acceptable and what's not. And our indicators are very clear on what's acceptable and what's not. So that would be really helpful too.
And I can add that from Access Now, we put on a summit conference series every year called RightsCon, and the call for proposals actually for next year will open up soon. So I bring this up because it's a good way for us as civil society, academics to get involved, to find a community of other like-minded activists to dive a bit deeper into these issues. But also, we have like private sector and government representatives who are there. So I think, RightsCon is another way just to tap into the vast resources that it's available within this tech community. And I'll add a link down there. So I see that we're coming up on time, and I guess to wrap up, I just have like one question for both of you to end things on a positive-ish note. So, as we look forward, based on the work that you've done, the campaigning that you've done, what is it that makes you hopeful for accountability in the tech sector, if anything? Hopefully something.
Well, I think I'll just go ahead and go. I think I see an increasing realization that corporate governance is just as important as state governance, and that this sort of movement for platform accountability or corporate accountability in the tech sector has broadened, so that it's not just a bunch of niche sort of human rights or digital rights or civil rights organizations talking to ourselves anymore. We're really I think we are building a movement. I think it's going to take some time to get the level of coordination that we want, but I tell you, the thing that gives me the most hope today is really like meeting Nandini and hearing about Check My Ads, and all, seeing that there are new approaches and new innovative ways of sort of tackling the things that are going on that people are coming up with and care about. And then as long as we have that kind of energy, and Sajwa, your energy as well in campaigning and all the work that you do with Access Now, that we'll be in good hands.
Totally co-sign. And I will just add that we, over the past 5 years, have created just such a massive network of fellow activists, of advocates, of researchers, of journalists, other organizations. And what we've been able to do over the past 5 years is grow from a Twitter account to just like a massive network of people who can help us, and just kind of rotating teams of people who have shared interests, and we're able to take on campaigns and really just kind of move one step forward with each effort and initiative. It's just incredible that I have like people that I can just hit up for questions that I have, or say, hey, do you want to collaborate on this thing? And they say yes, or they introduce us to someone who can help. We have just through research alone, we've brought in researchers who, again, like they come to us wanting to tell stories together. We promote them, they promote us. We've really kind of built a little universe of people who are all kind of working towards the same goals. And yeah, that's really what makes me hopeful. I just hope that we can all work together to make the world a better place.
I fully agree. And I think that's the question from Joe. I would say that just getting that question is something that makes me hopeful, right? The fact that it's not just us as people who spend our careers doing this, but that members, self-identified random members of the public are also interested in these issues as well, which it shouldn't be surprising that a sector that has such an impact on our daily lives is getting interest from everybody as well. So yeah, conversations like this make me hopeful. And just thank you again to Michael and others at UCLA for having this panel. I've learned so much, and I have like an entire page full of notes. And so just for my part, I've learned a lot about the issues we've talked about today. And a huge thank you to Nandini and to Jessica for such an enlightening conversation. I'm just very grateful to be part of this conversation with both of you. And thank you to everyone who, again, took time out of their week, their day to be part of this conversation. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the event.
Yeah, I will echo all of that and say thanks very much to Isadora for a fantastic moderation job. I knew bringing you together would result in a fantastic conversation, and I obviously was not disappointed. And it's great to hear that the conversations will keep going past this event, because that's certainly an important part of our goal, is to bring people together to foster further collaboration. That's fantastic. We have 2 papers that are going to be presented now. We're going to set up 2 breakout rooms at the bottom. Room 1 is going to be Alessia Zernata of McGill University will be presenting a paper on online misinformation, improving transparency and content moderation practices of social media companies, with the support of one of our fantastic LLM students, Lucia Chiban-Zamar. And in room number 2, Lila Montagnani and Mark Verstraete will be presenting Probing Personal Data. Lila is from Bocconi University, and Mark is from right here at the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. And they will be presenting that with the support of Sarah Cameron, another one of our RAs and a JD student here. So you can hop into one of those breakout rooms if you're interested. And then we will convene back in an hour for our final session, which will feature David Kay, Joran Marby, and Wendy Seltzer, which I'm also looking forward to very much. Thanks again to our fantastic panelists. I really enjoyed that, and looking forward to it.